The world just witnessed a moment that will echo through history. Pope Leo has broken his silence, unleashing a powerful condemnation of President Trump's Iran bombing and revealing secrets that the world was never meant to know. This isn't just another political drama, this is a turning point that could change the fate of millions. Every word, every revelation in this video will shake your understanding of global power. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover will leave you speechless. Subscribe now and comment your thoughts below. Let your voice be heard in this historic moment. A hush fell over the Vatican as the world's cameras turned, waiting for a statement that would ripple across continents. In the heart of Rome, Pope Leo stood before a sea of reporters, his expression grave, his voice unwavering. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes historic moments. Without preamble, he addressed the world, denouncing the recent bombing campaign in Iran, ordered by President Trump. His words, measured yet forceful, echoed through the marble halls and out into the world beyond. He spoke not just as a religious leader, but as a moral authority, invoking the principles of justice and peace that had guided his predecessors. The Pope's condemnation was not simply political, it was rooted in a deep concern for humanity. He described the suffering of innocent civilians, the destruction of ancient cities, and the shattering of families. The images of burning streets and terrified children flashed on screens as he spoke, lending weight to every syllable. The world listened, stunned. Never before had a pope so directly challenged the actions of a sitting American president. The Vatican statement was clear: the bombing was unjustifiable, a breach of international law and Christian ethics. The Pope called on world leaders to seek dialogue, not destruction, to build bridges rather than walls. His message was a rallying cry for peace, resonating far beyond the walls of the Vatican. But then, in a move that shocked even his closest advisors, Pope Leo revealed information that had been kept from the public. Documents he claimed had come into the Vatican's possession, evidence of secret meetings, covert operations, and back-channel negotiations that preceded the bombing. The Pope's aides distributed copies to the press, and the world's attention shifted from outrage to disbelief. The documents painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated campaign, one that involved not only military leaders but also powerful corporate interests. Emails, memos, and transcripts detailed discussions about resource control, strategic alliances, and the manipulation of public opinion. The narrative that had been presented to the world, a swift, necessary response to a threat, was now under scrutiny. As journalists pored over the evidence, questions multiplied. Who stood to benefit from the chaos in Iran? What promises had been made behind closed doors? The Pope urged transparency, demanding that those responsible be held to account. He called for an independent investigation, insisting that the truth must come to light, no matter how inconvenient. The fallout was immediate. Governments scrambled to respond, some denying involvement, others calling for restraint. Protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators carrying signs quoting the Pope's speech. Social media exploded with debate as people around the globe grappled with the implications of the revelations. Inside the White House, President Trump convened his advisors. The administration issued a statement dismissing the Pope's claims as misinformed, but the damage had been done. Allies expressed concern, and even some within Trump's own party began to question the official narrative. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the Iranian government seized on the Pope's words, calling for international solidarity against what they described as unprovoked aggression. The diplomatic landscape shifted overnight, with new alliances forming and old ones fracturing. Pope Leo, undeterred by the backlash, continued to speak out. He appeared on international broadcasts, met with world leaders, and addressed the United Nations. His message remained consistent: peace must prevail, and the truth must be told. The Vatican became a hub of activity, with diplomats and journalists flocking to Rome in search of answers. As the days passed, more information emerged. Whistleblowers came forward, corroborating the documents released by the Vatican. Investigative journalists uncovered financial transactions linking key figures to defense contractors and energy conglomerates. The story grew, encompassing not just the bombing of Iran, but a broader pattern of secrecy and manipulation at the highest levels of power. The world was watching, and the stakes could not have been higher. The confrontation between Pope Leo and President Trump became a defining moment, a clash of values and visions for the future. In churches, mosques and synagogues, people prayed for peace, while on the streets, citizens demanded justice. The question now was not just what had happened, but what would happen next. Would the revelations lead to meaningful change, or would they be swept aside in the rush of daily headlines? Pope Leo's challenge to the world was clear: to confront uncomfortable truths, to demand accountability, and to strive for a future defined by compassion rather than conflict. In the aftermath of Pope Leo's revelations, the global media entered a frenzy. News outlets dissected every word from the Vatican, replaying the Pope's speech and analyzing the documents for hidden meanings. Editorials debated the morality of military intervention, while talk shows hosted heated discussions between political analysts, ethicists, and religious leaders. The public's appetite for information seemed insatiable, and every new detail fueled the fire. In Washington, the administration struggled to regain control of the narrative. Senior officials appeared on television insisting that the president's actions were justified by national security concerns. They argued that the situation in Iran posed an imminent threat and that decisive action had been necessary to protect American lives and interests. Yet, as more evidence emerged, these justifications appeared increasingly tenuous. Behind closed doors, lawmakers from both parties demanded classified briefings. Some called for congressional hearings determined to uncover the truth behind the decision-making process. The specter of political fallout loomed large as public trust in the government wavered. Political commentators speculated about the impact on upcoming elections, with some predicting a seismic shift in the balance of power. Internationally, the Pope's intervention had a profound effect. European leaders, many of whom had previously hesitated to criticize the United States, now found themselves under pressure to take a stand. In emergency sessions, parliaments debated resolutions condemning the bombing and calling for an independent inquiry. The United Nations convened a special assembly with diplomats from around the world, voicing support for the Vatican's call for transparency and accountability. In the Middle East, the situation grew increasingly volatile. Iranian officials welcomed the Pope's support, using his words to rally their citizens and strengthen their diplomatic position. Anti-American sentiment surged, and protests erupted in several countries. At the same time, some voices within Iran called for restraint, hoping to avoid further escalation and bloodshed. Amid the chaos, Pope Leo remained a steady presence. He continued to advocate for peace, urging all parties to seek dialogue and reconciliation. His message resonated with millions, cutting across religious and political divides. Faith communities organized vigils and prayer services, while humanitarian organizations mobilized to assist those affected by the conflict. As investigations progressed, a more complete picture began to emerge. The documents released by the Vatican revealed a complex web of interests, with influential figures from government, industry, and the military working in concert. Whistleblowers described pressure to suppress dissenting opinions and manipulate intelligence. Financial records exposed lucrative contracts awarded to companies with close ties to senior officials. The revelations sparked a broader conversation about the ethics of power and the responsibilities of leadership. Scholars and activists drew parallels to past conflicts, warning of the dangers of unchecked authority and the erosion of democratic norms. The Pope's intervention, once seen as unprecedented, was now viewed by many as a necessary act of conscience. As the world grappled with these revelations, a sense of uncertainty prevailed. Old alliances were tested, and new ones began to form. The future of international relations hung in the balance, shaped by the actions of individuals willing to speak truth to power. Pope Leo's challenge had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone, and the world waited to see what would come next. As the days unfolded, the shockwaves from Pope Leo's disclosures continued to reverberate through every layer of society. In capitals across the globe, leaders convened emergency meetings to reassess their alliances and strategies. Intelligence agencies scrambled to verify the authenticity of the Vatican documents, while opposition parties seized the moment to demand greater oversight and accountability from their governments. In the United States, the political climate grew increasingly charged. Congressional committees launched formal inquiries, issuing subpoenas for key witnesses and classified communications. The media spotlight intensified on figures named in the leaked documents, with journalists tracking down sources and piecing together timelines. The public, once divided along partisan lines, now found common ground in a shared sense of betrayal and a growing demand for the truth. Protests became a daily occurrence in major cities. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, chanting for justice and waving banners with Pope Leo's words. Social movements gained momentum, uniting people from diverse backgrounds under a single cause to hold those in power accountable and to prevent future abuses. The atmosphere was electric, charged with both anger and hope. Meanwhile, the Vatican became a focal point for diplomatic activity. Ambassadors sought private audiences with Pope Leo, hoping to understand his intentions and to negotiate paths forward. The Pope, steadfast in his commitment to peace, welcomed dialogue but refused to compromise on his call for transparency. He emphasized that his actions were not an attack on any nation but a plea for moral responsibility and the protection of innocent lives. Religious communities worldwide responded with a mix of pride and apprehension. Many Catholics expressed admiration for the Pope's courage, while others worried about the potential for backlash. Interfaith leaders issued joint statements supporting the Vatican's stance, framing the crisis as a test of humanity's collective conscience. As investigators delved deeper, new layers of complexity emerged. It became clear that the Iran bombing was only the tip of the iceberg. The documents hinted at a broader pattern of covert operations and collusion between government officials and private interests spanning multiple administrations and continents. Analysts warned that the implications could reshape international relations for years to come. Financial markets reacted with volatility. Investors grew wary of instability, and stock prices for major defense contractors and energy companies fluctuated wildly. Economic advisors urged caution, warning that prolonged uncertainty could lead to recession or worse. Throughout it all, Pope Leo remained resolute. He continued to address the world using every platform available to advocate for truth and reconciliation. His unwavering stance inspired millions, but also drew fierce criticism from those who saw his actions as an overreach of papal authority. As the world teetered on the edge of a new era, the question lingered. Would this unprecedented confrontation between spiritual leadership and political power lead to lasting change, or would it fade into history as just another controversy? The answer, it seemed, depended not only on the decisions of leaders, but on the will of ordinary people determined to shape their own destiny. The mounting pressure forced the Trump administration to take a more defensive posture. Press conferences became increasingly tense, with officials dodging questions and repeating carefully crafted talking points. Attempts to discredit the Vatican's revelations were met with skepticism, as independent journalists and watchdog organizations corroborated many of the Pope's claims. The administration's credibility suffered, and cracks began to appear within its ranks. Some high-ranking officials quietly resigned or were reassigned, while others faced calls for impeachment. The political landscape shifted rapidly, with alliances fracturing and new coalitions forming. The American public, once polarized, found a rare moment of unity in demanding accountability and transparency. Grassroots movements organized town halls and rallies, turning the Pope's message into a catalyst for civic engagement. Internationally, the Pope's intervention reshaped diplomatic relations. Countries that had been hesitant to criticize the United States now voiced concerns openly. The United Nations passed resolutions calling for an independent investigation into the bombing and the broader covert operations revealed by the Vatican documents. Sanctions and diplomatic pressure mounted on those implicated, signaling a new era of global scrutiny. In Iran, the government leveraged the Pope's support to strengthen its position both domestically and internationally. While some factions pushed for retaliation, others advocated for cautious diplomacy to avoid further devastation. The people, caught between fear and hope, looked to the Vatican's message as a beacon for peace. Pope Leo's influence extended beyond politics. His bold stance sparked a worldwide conversation about the role of moral leadership in times of crisis. Religious leaders from various faiths joined him in calling for peace, justice, and reconciliation. Educational institutions incorporated the unfolding events into curricula, fostering critical discussions about ethics, power, and responsibility. Behind the scenes, investigative teams worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the covert operations. Financial trails led to shadowy networks of influence implicating corporations and individuals who had profited from conflict. Whistleblowers faced threats and intimidation, but their courage helped piece together a narrative of manipulation and greed. The Pope's challenge to the status quo inspired a new generation of activists and leaders committed to transparency and peace. His message resonated in communities around the world, fueling efforts to build bridges across divides and to hold power accountable. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that Pope Leo's intervention was not just a momentary shock, but a catalyst for profound change. The world stood at a crossroads, faced with the choice between repeating the mistakes of the past or forging a new path grounded in truth and compassion. The ongoing investigations began to yield results that stunned even the most seasoned observers. Congressional hearings broadcast live to millions revealed a staggering level of coordination between government officials and private interests prior to the Iran bombing. Testimonies from former intelligence officers and military advisors exposed how dissenting voices had been systematically silenced and how intelligence had been selectively presented to justify military action. The public watched as once trusted leaders struggled to explain their roles in the unfolding scandal. Internationally, the Vatican's call for transparency continued to gain traction. The United Nations established a special commission to examine the evidence, inviting independent experts and representatives from multiple countries. As the commission's work progressed, it became clear that the Iran operation was part of a broader pattern of covert interventions in the region, often masked by official narratives of security and stability. Pope Leo, meanwhile, remained at the center of global attention. He traveled to conflict zones, meeting with victims and humanitarian workers, and using his platform to amplify their voices. His visits drew massive crowds and extensive media coverage, further pressuring world leaders to respond to his calls for justice. The Pope's insistence on compassion and accountability resonated deeply, especially among those who had long felt powerless in the face of geopolitical maneuvering. In the United States, the political consequences intensified. Calls for impeachment grew louder, and several prominent figures faced criminal investigations. The administration's efforts to contain the fallout proved increasingly futile as new evidence emerged almost daily. Political commentators described the moment as a reckoning, a rare convergence of moral outrage and political will. The revelations also sparked a wave of legislative proposals aimed at increasing oversight of military and intelligence operations. Lawmakers debated reforms to ensure greater transparency and to prevent similar abuses in the future. Civil society organizations played a crucial role mobilizing public support and providing expert testimony to guide the reform process. On the streets, the movement inspired by Pope Leo showed no signs of slowing down. Demonstrations, vigils, and community forums became regular occurrences as people from all walks of life engaged in discussions about ethics, leadership, and the responsibilities of citizenship. The Pope's message had become a rallying cry for a global movement demanding a new standard of accountability. The economic impact of the crisis also became more pronounced. Markets remained volatile, and several multinational corporations faced investigations for their roles in the covert operations. Shareholders demanded answers, and some companies pledged to overhaul their practices in response to public pressure. The intertwining of economic interests and political power was laid bare, prompting calls for systemic change. Despite the turbulence, there was a growing sense of hope. The willingness of individuals to come forward, the determination of investigators to uncover the truth, and the courage of leaders like Pope Leo signaled a shift in the global order. The world was witnessing not just a crisis, but the birth of a movement that could redefine the relationship between power and morality. Part 610. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum sparked by Pope Leo's revelations only intensified. The United Nations Commission, working in tandem with independent watchdogs, released interim findings that confirmed the veracity of the Vatican's documents. The evidence showed a pattern of concealed motives and orchestrated misinformation implicating not only American officials but also influential figures in allied governments and multinational corporations. The Commission's findings sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Several governments announced internal reviews of their own intelligence and military protocols, and some high-ranking officials abroad resigned in disgrace. The European Union convened an emergency summit with leaders vowing to strengthen international norms against covert interventions and to support new mechanisms for transparency and accountability. In the United States, the political crisis reached fever pitch. Congressional hearings became must-watch television, with explosive testimonies revealing how public opinion had been manipulated through coordinated media campaigns and selective leaks. Lawmakers, under immense public pressure, advanced bipartisan legislation aimed at curbing executive overreach and increasing oversight of military actions. The president's approval ratings plummeted to historic lows, and several members of his inner circle were indicted on charges ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy. Amid the turmoil, Pope Leo continued his global advocacy. He addressed the United Nations General Assembly, delivering a speech that was widely hailed as one of the most consequential of the century. He called on all nations to recommit to the principles of peace, dignity, and shared responsibility. His words echoed in parliaments and places of worship alike, galvanizing a new generation of activists and leaders. Grassroots movements flourished, with millions participating in marches, teach-ins, and digital campaigns. The Pope's message inspired a wave of civic engagement as citizens demanded not only accountability for past actions, but also a new vision for the future. Universities hosted forums on ethics in leadership, and faith-based organizations launched initiatives to support victims of conflict and advocate for systemic reform. The economic ramifications deepened. Several corporations faced class action lawsuits from shareholders and affected communities, forcing boardroom reckonings and public apologies. Regulatory bodies in multiple countries launched investigations into lobbying practices and campaign contributions, exposing the extent to which private interests had influenced public policy. Through it all, the world watched as the balance of power shifted. Old alliances were tested and new coalitions emerged, united by a commitment to transparency and justice. The confrontation between Pope Leo and President Trump had become more than a political scandal. It was a catalyst for a global reckoning, a test of whether humanity could rise to meet the challenges of its own making.
End part 710.
The cultural impact of the crisis was unmistakable. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to document the unfolding events, capturing the public's sense of outrage and hope. Documentaries, podcasts, and best-selling books explored the intersection of faith, power, and truth, while major news outlets devoted special coverage to the ongoing investigations and the global movement for accountability. The phrase Leo's challenge became a shorthand for the moral awakening that was sweeping across societies. In schools and universities, students debated the ethical responsibilities of leaders and citizens alike. Curricula were updated to include case studies on the Iran bombing and the Vatican's intervention, encouraging critical thinking about the role of transparency and the dangers of unchecked authority. Young people, inspired by Pope Leo's courage, organized their own initiatives ranging from peace marches to online petitions, demanding a new era of honesty and justice in public life. Religious communities too experienced a transformation. Interfaith dialogues flourished as leaders from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other faiths found common ground in their calls for peace and accountability. The Pope's willingness to confront political power inspired clergy of all denominations to speak out against injustice, and houses of worship became centers for activism and support for victims of conflict. Meanwhile, the legal consequences continued to mount. Grand juries indicted several former officials and corporate executives, and high-profile trials dominated the headlines. Prosecutors presented evidence of backroom deals, falsified reports, and the deliberate suppression of dissenting voices. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had acted in the nation's best interests, but public opinion was firmly aligned with the demand for justice. Internationally, the United Nations Commission's final report was released to global anticipation. The document was comprehensive, detailing not only the events leading up to the Iran bombing, but also the systemic failures that had enabled such actions. The Commission recommended sweeping reforms, including the creation of an independent global watchdog to monitor military interventions and the strengthening of protections for whistleblowers. Governments around the world responded with a mix of acceptance and resistance. Some pledged to implement the Commission's recommendations, while others questioned the feasibility of international oversight. Nevertheless, the debate itself marked a turning point, signaling a new willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and to re-examine the foundations of global governance. Pope Leo, for his part, remained focused on the victims. He established a Vatican-led fund to support those affected by the conflict, and he continued to travel to regions scarred by war, offering comfort and solidarity. His humility and resolve won him admiration even from former critics, and his influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of religious authority. Through every twist and turn, the world's attention remained fixed on the unfolding drama. The confrontation between moral conviction and political expediency had become a defining story of the era, one that would shape the course of history for years to come. In Part 8:10, the aftershocks of the revelations continued to ripple outward, reshaping institutions and relationships at every level. In Washington, the legislative reforms inspired by the crisis began to take shape. Congress passed new laws mandating greater transparency for military actions, requiring that all future interventions undergo rigorous public and congressional review. Intelligence agencies faced stricter oversight, and whistleblower protections were expanded to encourage the reporting of abuses without fear of reprisal. These reforms, though hard-won, did not come without resistance. Powerful interests lobbied fiercely to preserve their influence, and some officials warned that excessive transparency could endanger national security. Yet the tide of public opinion was undeniable. Citizens demanded a government that served the people, not secret agendas, and lawmakers who ignored this call faced swift backlash at the ballot box. Internationally, the United Nations adopted several of the Commission's recommendations, establishing a permanent body to monitor compliance with international law regarding military interventions. Countries that had once operated in the shadows now found themselves under global scrutiny. The threat of sanctions and diplomatic isolation forced many to reconsider their strategies, and a new era of cautious diplomacy began to take hold. Pope Leo's leadership remained a guiding force. He convened a historic interfaith summit in Rome, bringing together leaders from across the religious and political spectrum. The summit produced a declaration affirming the sanctity of human life and the imperative of peace, signed by representatives of dozens of nations and faiths. The event was broadcast worldwide, and millions watched as former adversaries embraced in the spirit of reconciliation. At the grassroots, the movement for justice and transparency flourished. Community organizations launched educational campaigns teaching citizens how to hold their leaders accountable and how to recognize the warning signs of propaganda and manipulation. Social media became a powerful tool for organizing and advocacy, connecting people across borders and backgrounds in pursuit of common goals. The economic landscape also began to shift. Corporations implicated in the scandal faced unprecedented pressure to reform, with many instituting new policies on ethical conduct and transparency. Investors demanded greater accountability, and some companies pledged to redirect profits toward rebuilding communities affected by conflict. The intertwining of business and politics, once hidden from view, was now the subject of open debate and reform. Through it all, the stories of ordinary people affected by the Iran bombing and its aftermath came to the forefront. Journalists and filmmakers told their stories of loss, resilience, and hope, reminding the world that behind every headline were real lives forever changed. Humanitarian aid flowed more freely, and international organizations coordinated efforts to provide relief and support reconstruction. As the world adjusted to this new reality, the legacy of Pope Leo's intervention became clear. He had not only exposed the truth, but had also inspired a movement that transcended borders, faiths, and ideologies. The confrontation with President Trump and the revelations about Iran were now understood as a turning point, a moment when the world chose to reckon with its past and strive for a more just and peaceful future. To Part 910. As the dust settled over the political and social upheaval, the world entered a period of reflection and reconstruction. The reforms and accountability measures set in motion by the crisis began to yield tangible results. Governments, under the watchful eye of both their citizens and the international community, became more transparent in their operations. Public trust, though still fragile, slowly began to recover as leaders demonstrated a renewed commitment to ethical governance. Pope Leo's role as a moral compass remained undiminished. He continued to travel, meeting with survivors of conflict and leaders of nations, always urging dialogue over division. His speeches were now quoted in parliaments and classrooms alike, and his insistence on truth and compassion became a benchmark against which public figures were measured. The Vatican's influence in global affairs, once largely symbolic, had become a real force for advocacy and mediation. The United States, still grappling with the fallout from the Iran scandal, underwent a profound political transformation. The new laws and oversight mechanisms fundamentally altered the balance of power between the executive branch and the legislature. Presidential authority over military action was curbed, and a new generation of leaders, many inspired by the movement Pope Leo had sparked, rose to prominence on platforms of transparency and reform. Internationally, the landscape was equally transformed. The United Nations' new oversight body began its work investigating not just the Iran incident, but other covert interventions around the world. Several countries voluntarily disclosed past actions, seeking to demonstrate their commitment to the new era of openness. Diplomatic relations, once strained by suspicion and secrecy, were gradually rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and accountability. The economic world, too, continued to adapt. Corporate governance standards were revised with greater emphasis on ethical conduct and social responsibility. Companies that had been implicated in the crisis faced ongoing scrutiny, but many emerged stronger for having embraced reform. Investors and consumers alike prioritized transparency, rewarding businesses that demonstrated a genuine commitment to positive change. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural shift that had begun in the wake of Pope Leo's revelations showed no signs of waning. The arts, media, and education sectors continued to explore the themes of truth, power, and reconciliation. New generations grew up with the story of Leo's challenge as a formative lesson, a reminder of the importance of courage, conscience, and collective action. In communities affected by the Iran bombing, the process of healing was slow but steady. International aid and reconstruction efforts, now better coordinated and more transparent, brought real improvements to daily life. Local leaders, empowered by global attention, advocated for their people's needs and ensured that their voices were heard in the halls of power. As the anniversary of Pope Leo's historic speech approached, preparations began for commemorations around the world. The Vatican announced a global day of reflection, inviting people of all faiths and backgrounds to consider the lessons of the past and the responsibilities of the present. The world, once shaken by scandal and division, now stood at the threshold of a new era, one defined not by secrecy and suspicion, but by hope, accountability, and the enduring power of truth. Part 1010. On the Day of Global Reflection, cities across continents marked the occasion with ceremonies, discussions, and acts of service. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples opened their doors for interfaith prayers, while civic centers hosted forums on ethical leadership and the responsibilities of citizenship in a connected world. The media broadcast retrospectives reminding viewers of the chain of events that began with Pope Leo's bold decision to speak out. In Rome, Pope Leo addressed the world from St. Peter's Square. His words carried live to billions. He spoke not of victory or vindication, but of humility and shared responsibility. He reminded listeners that the pursuit of truth is never easy, and that the work of peace and justice is ongoing, a task for every generation. He honored the courage of whistleblowers, the resilience of victims, and the determination of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The Pope's message was echoed by leaders everywhere. Presidents, prime ministers, and community organizers acknowledged the profound changes that had swept their societies. Many pledged to continue the work of reform, to safeguard transparency, and to resist the temptations of secrecy and unchecked power. The United Nations, in a special session, adopted a resolution affirming the principles that had guided the global response: truth, accountability, and the sanctity of human life. In the United States, the anniversary was marked by a bipartisan gathering on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers, activists, and citizens reflected on the lessons learned and the reforms achieved. Memorials were held for those lost in the Iran bombing and for all victims of conflict, with calls to ensure that their suffering would not be forgotten or repeated. The cultural legacy of the crisis endured. Artists unveiled new works inspired by the movement, and educators launched programs to teach the next generation about the importance of ethical leadership. The phrase "Leo's Challenge" entered the lexicon as a symbol of moral courage, a reminder that one voice grounded in conviction and compassion can indeed change the world. As the sun set on this day of reflection, a sense of cautious optimism prevailed. The world was not perfect, conflict and injustice still existed, but the events set in motion by Pope Leo had proven that change was possible. The structures of accountability and transparency, once considered unattainable, had become part of the global order. People everywhere understood that their voices mattered and that the pursuit of truth and justice was a collective, never-ending journey. Pope Leo, now regarded as one of the most influential moral leaders of his era, concluded his address with a simple but powerful call. Let us never be silent in the face of injustice. Let us always choose the path of truth, no matter how difficult. And let us remember that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, compassion, and hope. With that, the world moved forward, not unchanged, but awakened, and forever marked by the moment when conscience triumphed over secrecy and the call for truth reshaped history.